Everyone, thank you all for joining us. This is a presentation hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in order to facilitate understanding of the 2014 Small Vessel General Permit. The agenda for today's webinar includes a brief presentation and responses to your questions. We're pleased to have so many of you here today. And due to the number of attendees, we have muted all the lines except for our presenter's line. So if you have a question during the webinar, we encourage you to type that and submit them as they come to you using the GoToWebinar program on your screen. You may need to expand the control panel shown on the right of your screen by clicking on the orange arrow button. You'll see a bold heading titled Questions, and when you click on the plus sign to expand that box, you'll have a text box to type and submit your questions here to EPA staff. EPA staff will respond to your questions at the halfway point in the presentation and at the end of the presentation. We may not get to all of your questions, but we will be reading them as they come in and provide as much information as possible. We will also be recording this presentation and posting the recording to EPA's website as a way to share it for those who couldn't attend today. And as one final announcement, at the end of the webinar, a survey will appear on your screen requesting feedback for today's presentation. Your input is very important to us, so please look out for that. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Jack Faulk and Captain Kelly of EPA's Office of Wastewater Management to begin the presentation. Jack?
Thanks, Katie. And welcome everyone to hear about EPA's recently issued Small Vessel General Permit, also known as the SVGP. I'll probably use the terms interchangeably throughout. A little bit about me, as Katie mentioned, I'm Jack Faulk. I work at EPA in the Office of Water Permits Division in Washington, D.C. I've been working on water permits for about 25 years, either at EPA or as a contractor to EPA. That being said, so let's get into the presentation and hopefully you'll learn more about what EPA's SVGP is all about. I'm going to first give a brief description of the background on why EPA took this action, a little bit about why now, and some history to put it in better context. As Katie mentioned, we'll take a couple of breaks throughout the webinar to answer some of your questions. So hopefully when you leave today, you'll have a better understanding of the SVGP. Before I get into the details, we'd like to get to know about you a little bit. So here's the first of two poll questions that we want to ask here. The first one asks what part of the country you consider to be your primary interest associated with the SVGP. The software limits how many choices we can provide, so we kind of group things on the ones we think are most common. So if you could make your selection and we can take a look at the results, hopefully get a sense of where folks are from. We have about 3/4 of folks that have answered, and
so it looks like we have about 17% are looking at the entire U.S., about 43% are inland in U.S. waters, 30% are in the Atlantic, Pacific, or Gulf Coast, and then 11% in Alaska.
All right, thanks, Kate. And now let's go to the next poll question. And it asks, what type of small vessels does your organization primarily represent? Commercial fishing vessels, passenger transportation vessels, utility vessels, freight barges, or other. And I will say that these are the categories that as we developed the permit, we kind of identified as the most common types of vessels that we identified to be covered under the permit. So let's see what we get. I think one thing that we found is that the commercial fishing industry has expressed concern that the timing may not have been great for today's webinar. as Katie mentioned, one of the beauties is that this gets recorded and can be viewed at any time. We'll let folks know when that becomes available, and you can share it with people who are interested.
So it looks like we have about 16% of our audience is commercial fishing, 23% is passenger transportation vessels, 23% utility vessels, 9% freight barges, and 29% other. Good mix.
Okay, good. So I'm not going to spend too much time discussing the details of the Clean Water Act and the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, known as NPDES, but I think it's important that everyone have a basic understanding of these requirements. The Clean Water Act forms the basis of today's permitting requirements, and that act was created in 1972. The Act specifies that discharges of any pollutant to waters of the United States by any person is unlawful unless the discharges are in compliance with the Act. One way to discharge pollutants legally is by obtaining authorization to do so under a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit, as established in Section 402 of the Act. The SVGP that I'm discussing today is an NPDES permit consistent with Section 402, and as you'll see, is effective for 5 years from the effective date of the permit, which is consistent with the Clean Water Act that limits NPDES permits for a period of up to 5 years. For those of you familiar with where the U.S. regulations are published, the bulk of the NPDES requirements have been codified in the federal regulations at Title 40, Part 122, which is specifically titled National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Historically, EPA had not required discharges incidental to the normal operation of a vessel to obtain NPDES permits, but we were sued in 2003 in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California, who ruled that EPA should vacate the rule exempting such discharges from permitting. We appealed the decision to the Ninth Circuit, and in July 2008, the Ninth Circuit upheld the lower court's ruling. This meant that effective December 19, 2008, discharges incidental to the normal operation of many types of vessels that had historically been excluded from NPDES permitting were now required to obtain coverage under an NPDES permit. Also in July 2008, in response to the court's decision, the Clean Boating Act of 2008 was signed into law. The Clean Boating Act did several things. For one, it provided that recreational vessels are not required to obtain NPDES permit coverage for discharges. It also directed EPA to evaluate recreational vessel discharges and develop management practices for appropriate discharges and promulgate performance standards for those practices. The law also directs the Coast Guard to then publish and enforce those regulations for use of these practices. For today's webinar, we're not going to be discussing the implications associated with standards for recreational vessels. Also in 2008, a second piece of legislation was signed into law. That law provided a 2-year moratorium from permitting for incidental discharges from commercial fishing vessels and small vessels less than 79 feet. This was to give EPA time to study these vessels and prepare a report to Congress on the impacts of incidental discharges from these vessels. EPA submitted its completed study to Congress in August 2010. Since then, Congress has extended the moratorium twice for 1 additional year each, with the current moratorium expiring on December 18th of this year. The SVGP issued on September 10th, 2014 provides a mechanism for small vessels to obtain an NPDES permit beginning on December 19th, that is, the day after the moratorium expires, should Congress not further extend the moratorium. EPA took this action because, as written, should the moratorium expire on the 18th, any incidental discharges from small vessels to waters of the United States after that date are in violation of the Clean Water Act and potentially subject to the enforcement provisions of the Act unless covered by an NPDES permit. Some of you might be aware that there have been a variety of bills drafted by Congress in the past year or so that would either further extend the moratorium or make the moratorium permanent. At present, there's been no final action on those bills, and EPA, as part of the executive branch, really doesn't get involved in the decision-making of which laws to enact or not. We just basically implement the laws as written and signed by the President. Note that the moratorium did not exempt ballast water discharges or other discharges from vessels when it is not operating in a capacity as a means of transportation. For example, if a vessel is used as a mining facility, it has not been exempt from permitting. Those discharges have always and continue to need an NPDES permit. The Clean Water Act and NPDES regulations require that all NPDES permits be public notice for comment before being finalized. We proposed the small vessel general permit in 2011 at the same time as the NPDES permit proposed for larger vessels. That larger vessel permit, known simply as the Vessel General Permit, or VGP, was initially issued in 2008, with the second iteration published in April of 2013 and effective on December 19th of last year. Notice of the issuance of the final SVGP was published in the Federal Register a couple weeks ago on September 10th, and consistent with the end of the moratorium, becomes effective on December 19th of this year. A copy of the SVGP and supporting information is available on EPA's website, as well as in the SVGP docket on the federal government's regulations.gov website. The SVGP is available for any eligible vessels operating in waters subject to the 2014 SVGP with discharges incidental to the normal operation of the vessel. Let's take a closer look at what that means. Consistent with the types of vessels included in the permitting moratorium, the SVGP will provide permit coverage for those vessels once the moratorium ends. Specifically, that includes all non-recreational, non-military vessels less than 79 feet in length that are operating in a capacity as a means of transportation. Note that once the moratorium ends, commercial fishing vessels larger than 79 feet will need permit coverage, but will have to do so through the VGP, not the SVGP. One of the questions we've been getting the most is what is meant by the term non-recreational vessels, since recreational vessels are not subject to permit requirements. As defined in the Clean Boating Act, a recreational vessel is any vessel that is either manufactured or used primarily for pleasure or leased, rented, or chartered to a person for the pleasure of that person. The term recreational vessel doesn't include a vessel that is both subject to Coast Guard inspection and either engaged in commercial use or carries paying passengers. What we're hearing is that the biggest question related to the definition of recreational vessel lies in what is meant by the term manufactured or used primarily for pleasure. The permit and permit fact sheet, both of which are available on our NPDES website, provide additional insight into what that term means. But here are some examples of EPA's interpretation of the types of vessels not subject to NPDES permitting because of them being recreational. For example, a Boston whaler type wrecked vessel manufactured for activities like water skiing, but used for law enforcement purposes, such as by a state police department or Fish and Wildlife Agency. In these instances, SVG permit coverage is not required for incidental discharges from these vessels. Another example is a 26-foot aluminum hull John boat, flat bottom, or skiff used by an agency for surveying, water patrols, inspections, or the like, for which the same model was also manufactured and used for recreational use. Again, no permit is needed for incidental discharges from these vessels. Similarly, other small vessels originally manufactured for pleasure and not subject to Coast Guard inspection are exempt. as would be a small vessel chartered to a person for their pleasure, such as for fishing, and not subject to Coast Guard inspection. So now that we know who doesn't need coverage, let's take a look at who does need SVGP coverage. Based on our analysis during development of the permit, we identified approximately 115 to 138,000 vessels meet the eligibility requirements for the SVGP, that being vessels less than 79 feet operating in capacity as a means of transportation. About half those vessels are commercial fishing vessels, with the rest including passenger vessels, utility vessels, and freight barges. EPA presented these data as part of the agency's economic and benefit analysis for the draft and final permit, a copy of which can be viewed in the permit docket on regulations.gov. The next piece of the eligibility determination is that permit coverage is needed for discharges to waters subject to the permit. As detailed in the permit and consistent with the Clean Water Act and NPDES permit program, permits are required for discharges to waters of the U.S. as defined in our regulations, extending to the outer reach of the 3-mile territorial sea and including navigable waters of the Great Lakes subject to U.S. jurisdiction. The term waters of the U.S. has been as much debated concept, and in fact, the proposed rule clarifying the definition of the term is currently out for public comment, with comments due by October 20th. One of the nice things, though, about permitting of vessels is that the definition of waters of the U.S. is not nearly as big of a deal, since waters of the U.S. include navigable waters, which by definition includes vessels. The final piece of the eligibility determination is to identify the types of discharges eligible for coverage under the permit. Specifically, NPDES permit coverage is required for discharges incidental to the normal operation of a vessel when operating as a means of transportation, unless they are otherwise not eligible from the permit coverage as detailed in Part 1.5 of the permit. Incidental discharges include discharges such as the ones shown on the list on the slide. Logically, these are the types of discharges incidental to the normal operation of a vessel. I'm not going to go through the list. This is not the exhaustive list, but the most common discharges that will be covered under the permit. Part 1.5 of the permit identifies the types of discharges not eligible for coverage under the permit. Obviously, discharges not incidental are not eligible for permit coverage. This includes discharges when the vessel is not operating as a means of transportation, such as when the vessel is being used as an energy or mining facility, storage facility, or seafood processing facility. Also, discharges that are regulated by other parts of the Clean Water Act or other statutes altogether, likewise, are in many instances not eligible for coverage under the SVGP. Medical wastes, noxious liquid substance residues, sewage, used or spent oil, and garbage and trash are types of discharges regulated in other ways. The permit also doesn't provide permit coverage for discharges that are currently or previously covered by another NPDES permit, unless EPA specifically authorizes those discharges, or unless that previous permit was the vessel general permit. In that limited instance, if eligible, those discharges that were covered under the VGP can be covered under the SVGP. So in a nutshell, that provides an overview of the types of discharges required and eligible to be covered under the recently issued SVGP. Once a vessel determines that permit coverage is needed, the owner-operator of that vessel has to comply with the terms of the permit. This slide shows the sections of the SVGP. It's 53 pages long and is available for download from EPA's website. But of the 53 pages, the bulk of the requirements that I'm going to discuss today are really on fewer than 10 of those pages. Once you determine you need permit coverage, the bulk of these specific requirements are on pages 7 through 15. So the 53 pages may not be as intimidating once you actually get into the permit itself. That being said, I'm going to go through each of the permit sections. And once someone determines that they need coverage under the permit, the first question that you always hear is, what do I have to do to get covered? Obtaining coverage is simple. Unlike the vessel's general permit, the SVGP doesn't require anybody to submit a notice of intent, or unlike other NPDES permits, doesn't require submission of a permit application. Instead, the owner-operator of the vessel needs to complete the Permit Authorization and Record of Inspection form, also known as the PERI form. It may be tough to read on this page, but the PERI form requires the owner-operator of the vessel to fill out their name and basic vessel information, and then sign the form acknowledging that they have read the permit and are familiar with it and are implementing the requirements in the permit. The PERI form is to be signed and dated by an authorized signatory of the company or a duly authorized representative of that person. Part 3.1 of the permit provides additional details of who that person is, but it can include the person in charge of the vessel, such as the master. Once signed, the PERI form is to be kept on board the vessel, either in paper or electronically. That's all that's necessary to be covered. Of course, getting covered is just the first step in complying with the permit, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time discussing the specific requirements that must be followed once you're covered by the permit. But before I get into the details, I want to take a break and answer a few questions that we've received regarding eligibility and permit coverage.
Okay, so for the first question, how about what about blackwater sewage that's treated with an approved U.S. Coast Guard sewer treatment plant? Is that covered under this permit?
Sorry, I can't read. The permit does not cover sewage. That sewage is regulated by a different section of the Clean Water Act directly, which is not. So you have to comply with, what's it, Section 311, 310, 312 of the Clean Water Act, but that's outside of the SVGP.
And then follow up, just to confirm, a Boston whaler type vessel used as a utility boat does not need permit coverage. Your example.
Yeah, assuming that Boston whaler is manufactured as a recreational vessel, then that's correct. It would not need NPDES permit coverage.
What are the fines for noncompliance with the SVGP?
The Clean Water Act establishes fines that actually are updated periodically and vary depending on the type of violation, but I believe now have gotten up to potentially $37,500 per day per violation as a maximum for any violation, but really is up to an inspector and the enforcement office to make the decision as to what those penalties to incur will actually be.
Is the form different from the VGP PARI form?
Yes. I believe the VGP PARI form has an annual inspection requirement. I'm not 100% certain of the nuances of the different. They're similar in the fact that they require very, very basic information, and then I'll talk about it a little bit later, for the form to be signed periodically after quarterly inspections. But off the top of my head, I don't recall if the PERI form for the VGP is quarterly or annual.
I believe it's quarterly.
Okay.
But either way, you would need, if you're an SVGP vessel, you would need to sign and certify the SVGP PARI form, because that's where you're certifying that you read and understand the terms of the permit as it applies to you. You'd want to make sure you use the SVGP version. Are emergency response boats used for oil booms, drills, etc. on water near the site covered by this permit? So does this apply to emergency vessels? I'll answer. So it applies to effectively any non-recreational, non-military vessel operating as a means of transportation. So even if it's an emergency vessel and still can fall under those eligibility definitions, then yes, the SVGP and the terms of the SVGP would still apply.
We'll take one more question here.
Okay. Are U.S. Army Corps of Engineers vessels considered military vessels for permit purposes? And I think the answer to that is no. We had an earlier slide, there was a reference to the citation for the definition of vessels of the armed forces, and that's the scope of the applicability when we say non-military vessels. So you're a military vessel if you meet the definition of a vessel of the armed forces, and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers vessels do not fall under that category. As we said, they may, applicability may be determined based on whether or not they fall under the category of a non-recreational vessel.
Cool. Well, we got a long list of questions. We're going to move on to try and get through the presentation. We have time at the end where we'll take some more. And then I'll also show an email address if you have additional questions that you can send those to us and we can get back to you hopefully in a day or two. What was I going to say? Oh, and we're also working on some frequently asked questions that we hope to make available in the next few weeks that we'll post on our website to hopefully provide additional insight into the applicability of the SVGP and the requirements in it. So let's move on. I had talked about part one of the permit, really the permit coverage and eligibility. Part two of the permit contains what the NPDES regulations call the effluent limits. For the SVGP, effluent limits are narrative requirements that vessels must follow. Specifically, Part 2 contains best management practices that are to be implemented to control a vessel's incidental discharges. Part 2 of the permit is 8 pages long and includes the bulk of the permit's requirements. I'll go through each of the 11 subparts in Part 2 briefly on the coming slides, but I'm really only going to hit the high points of the requirements as I walk through them. So that to see the actual requirements, you're going to have to read the permit. And I can't stress that enough. You really have to read the permit to determine what you have to do to comply with the permit. I know I've heard in other permits that folks feel filling out the PARI form or the NOI form is really what they have to do, and once they've done that, they're covered under the permit. But that's really just a small first step in the process. You have to comply with the rest of the permit, which is often 98% of the other requirements. So hopefully the summary I'm going to give will give you a good sense of what to expect in the rest of the permit. So Part 2.1 contains general requirements that vessels have to follow specific to discharges. Throughout the permit, the term minimize is used repeatedly to establish the level of control required. I'll discuss it briefly later, but Part 5 of the permit includes definitions of key terms used in the permit. The term minimize, as defined in Part 5, means to reduce and or eliminate to the extent achievable using control measures, including best management practices that are technologically available and economically practicable and achievable in light of best marine practice. I know that's a mouthful, but it's a fairly general definition, leaving room for flexibility for the permittee to identify what is available and practicable. You should consider those facts when determining steps to take to comply with the permit where it requires minimization. In some instances, that may mean elimination of a discharge altogether, while in other instances that may mean no action is necessary. That being said, Part 2.1 requires you to minimize the potential for the discharge of pollutants, such as foam or floating solids and spills. Additionally, the permit prohibits the discharge of garbage or oil in quantities that may be harmful or cause a visible sheen, which is consistent with the existing requirements for oil under the Oil Pollution Act. The permit also prohibits the discharge of certain toxic antifreeze mixtures and also minimizes the discharge of other types of antifreeze. Permit also requires, when feasible, to perform major cleaning, maintenance, and repair while the vessel is out of the water or in dry dock. Again, note the term when feasible. This is a determination to be made by you or the vessel operator. The general requirements also specify use of minimally toxic, phosphate-free, and biodegradable soaps, detergents, and cleaners. This is one area of the permit that EPA identified as potentially incurring additional costs for vessel operators beyond what is currently practiced. But as part of permit development, we looked into the available green products and determined that there were comparably priced cleaners available that meet these criteria. The terms minimally toxic, phosphate-free, and biodegradable are also identified in Part 5 of the permit. A final requirement in Part 2.1 is that while the vessel engine is operating, you should frequently check to ensure no visible sheen, dust, chemicals, or other unusual discoloration are originating from the vessel. Part 2.2 of the permit addresses fuel management. The permit specifies that new motorized vessels, those constructed after the effective date of the permit, must have a functioning fuel air separator or fuel tank vent to prevent fuel spills. Existing vessels have to either have a functioning fuel air separator or fuel tank vent or use oil absorbent material or similar device when fueling the vessel to prevent discharges into water subject to the permit. The permit also notes that operators should prevent overfilling tanks, such as by not topping off fuel tanks, and should regularly inspect fuel and hydraulic systems for damage or leaks and repair or replace damaged parts as soon as possible. Also, operators should fill portable fuel tanks on shore to the extent practicable. Part 2.3 includes requirements for engine and oil control and generally includes conditions that are already performed on vessels, such as periodically inspecting the engine for any loose or leaking hoses, gaskets, or seals, cleaning up spills or overflows, disposing of used oil absorbent materials appropriately, and periodically checking for the presence of a visible sheen in surrounding waters, and suspending the offending discharge and cleaning up the oil immediately. There are two specific conditions, though, that I want to highlight here. One, the permit prohibits the use on the vessel of any substance, including dispersants, detergents, or other substances that remove the appearance of a visible sheen. So the expectation is that you will use physical methods to remove oils rather than chemical methods. And number two, for any equipment where discharges of oil are likely to occur, vessels must use environmentally acceptable lubricants, or EALs as they're called in the permit, unless technically infeasible. And let me talk a little bit about what we mean by the term technically infeasible. The VGP for larger vessels contains a similar EAL provision, and we've received a number of questions regarding that concept. So I thought I'd include more details on it here. Note that we actually do have frequently asked questions on our website related to EALs for large vessels that you'll find will be fairly relevant to the SVGP as well. The definition of technically infeasible means one of the items identified on this list, namely that, one, no EAL products are approved for use in a given application that meet manufacturer specifications for that equipment. Two, Products that come pre-lubricated have no available alternatives manufactured with the ALs. 3, products meeting manufacturer specifications are not available within any port in which the vessel calls. Or 4, changeover and use of an EAL must wait until the vessel's next dry docking. When a vessel operator determines that EALs are technically infeasible, these products are not required to be used. I'll note, though, that this determination must be made on each specific piece of equipment independently, and that the determination may change over time. So what may be technically infeasible today may be feasible at a later point in time, at which point EPA would expect the use of EALs for that application. Part 2.4 of the permit requires operators to properly manage trash and garbage to prevent the discharge of such from the vessel. That is, to maintain a tidy deck. This is to include appropriate trash receptacles and to secure items such as toxic and hazardous materials and fishing gear to prevent them from being discharged. Also, prior to transporting a vessel from one water body to another, any accumulated bilge water should be removed. The permit also prohibits the discharge of unused live bait overboard, except for bait caught in that water body or in that watershed. Part 2.5 applies to deck washdown and runoff and above waterline hull cleaning, and consistent with Part 2.1 requires operators to use, I'll use the term green cleaners, consistent with the label on those products. Operators also have to prevent the introduction of on-deck debris, garbage, residue, and spills into deck washdown and runoff, and minimize the discharge of paint chips and residue, especially during cleaning, maintenance, and painting. Paint waste is to be disposed of onshore, consistent with applicable waste management regulations. 2.6 includes requirements for vessel hull maintenance and focuses heavily on anti-fouling coatings. The permit requires use of less toxic coating alternatives, including a prohibition against using tributyl tin-based coatings, or to not use such anti-fouling coatings at all if unnecessary, and to select coatings that are not designed to slough or peel. The permit requires that the operator inspect the hull at least quarterly and clean as necessary, and that when cleaning, check for plumes of paint and stop cleaning if plumes of paint are identified, and reassess cleaning techniques. In some instances, you may consider hiring a professional cleaner. When cleaning vessels out of the water, paint wastes are to be collected and disposed of properly, and when transporting a vessel from one water body to another, the vessel hull should be inspected and any organisms removed and disposed of properly onshore. Part 2.7 includes requirements for gray water and focuses on minimizing gray water discharges in high traffic, recreational, and certain sensitive areas as described in the permit, such as in national wildlife refuges and marine sanctuaries. It also specifies that vessels should minimize gray water production while stationary in confined waters, and if possible, store gray water for discharge onshore or once the vessel is underway. Again, the permit clarifies that operators must use appropriate cleaners and do not add excess oils to the gray water system. Part 2.8 of the permit includes requirements specific to discharges from fish holds. Operators should take all reasonable steps to prevent the discharge of excess fish hold water and ice while stationary at the pier. Screens or similar separation devices should be used to capture large solid pieces of fish if pierside discharge is required. Fish solids must not be disposed of pierside or in other enclosed coastal waters, but can be discharged at sea or on land. Also, fish hold effluent should be discharged to a shore-based facility if such is available and economically achievable, and that facility is appropriately permitted. Note that once through circulating water used to keep fish alive is exempt from that requirement. And again, the permit requires use of appropriate cleaners when cleaning out fish holds. Part 2.9 contains specific requirements for ballast water discharges. Vessels must minimize or avoid the discharge or uptake of ballast water in certain sensitive areas and at certain times, such as in darkness when bottom-dwelling organisms may rise up from the bottom. Vessels should also discharge only the minimal amount of ballast water necessary for essential vessel operations, and when feasible and safe, use ballast water pumps instead of gravity to empty the tanks. Finally, when feasible, vessels should use alternative ballast water management techniques, such as using potable water for ballasting, using onshore treatment or disposal, or for vessels that operate on fixed routes, capturing and reusing ballast water in each port. Part 2.10 includes requirements for overboard cooling water discharges, and that section merely recommends that vessels consider using shore-based power when the vessel is in port to reduce cooling water needs if shore-based power is readily available. Supply systems are adequate and the vessel is equipped to connect with said systems. And finally, last part in part 2, 2.11, there are no real additional requirements in this part. Merely clarifies that operators are required to meet any other laws related to incidental discharges from vessels, such as oil and hazardous substance requirements, etc. And that's the extent of the BMPs for operators of small vessels. That gets us through 2 parts of the 7 parts of the permit, but really Part 2 contains the bulk of the responsibilities for small vessels. Let me go through a few more sections and then we'll do a couple poll questions and then hopefully have some time at the end for additional questions. So Part 3 of the permit identifies the required monitoring and record keeping requirements. 3.1 includes the record keeping requirements. And as mentioned previously, an authorized official or duly authorized representative must sign and certify the PERI form, and that form has to be kept on board the vessel, either in paper or electronic form. I'll show you on the next slide, but operators are required to perform quarterly visual inspections, but the PERI form requiring that the operator sign the form each quarter, acknowledging completion of the inspection and identifying any problems and corrective actions taken in response to those problems. Operators are required to keep these records for 3 years after their coverage under the permit ends. Part 3.2 includes the quarterly visual inspection requirements. The inspection is to be performed by an authorized official or their duly authorized representative and should check all discharges in areas of the vessels that impact discharges, including visible portions of the hull. The inspector should ensure that all areas of the vessel are free from garbage, exposed raw materials, etc., and should check that all seals and equipment are properly lubricated and in operating condition. Any problems identified must be corrected as soon as possible. Note that the permit includes a provision that any vessel kept on land for the full calendar quarter doesn't have to be inspected during that quarter, although that determination does have to be documented on the PERI form. And this is a copy of the second page of the PERI form for documenting any problems found during the inspection and the corrective actions taken or to be taken to address those problems. Like the first page of the PERI, this form doesn't have to be submitted to EPA, but merely be retained on board the vessel, either in paper or electronically. And that really is the extent of the record keeping and reporting requirements with Faulk, there really are no reporting requirements other than one I'm going to show you later on, but in terms of record keeping, it's really the PERI and the results of the inspections. Part 4 of the permit contains additional requirements that are generally similar for all types of NPDES permits. You may often hear these referred to as standard conditions. By and large, Part 4 contains standard conditions regarding administrative and legal rights specific to operators covered under the permit. I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I will highlight Part 4.10 in the standard permit conditions. There's a requirement to submit an annual report to EPA if you identify any permit noncompliance during the calendar year. And in Appendix B, there's a copy of an annual noncompliance report form that should you determine during the year that you've violated a part of the permit, you're to fill out that form and submit it to the applicable EPA regional contact, and the specific contacts are included in the permit. I will show you kind of where that is in a couple slides. So with that, for those of you that survived, I want to ask a couple more poll questions to gauge your understanding of the permit requirements. First, based on what you've read in the permit and heard today, which section of the permit do you believe will be the most challenging for small vessel operators to follow? Quarterly inspections and record keeping, engine and oil control, fuel management, vessel hull maintenance, or other. And again, remember, engine and oil control includes things like EALs, inspecting and keeping the engine in good working condition. Fuel management includes things like having a functioning fuel air separator, fuel tank vent, or oil absorbent materials. Vessel hull maintenance includes things like being careful about anti-fouling coatings and cleaning appropriately and gently. Inspections and record keeping, the quarterly inspections and keeping basically records of those. Or if there are other items such as tidy deck, maintaining a tidy deck, or managing gray water, ballast water, or fish hold effluent.
Okay, so the majority have voted. It looks like 43% say that quarterly inspections and record keeping may be the most challenging to follow. 24% said engine and oil control, 20% said vessel hull maintenance, 12% other, and only 2% on fuel management.
Well, I have to admit that makes me feel good because I look at the quarterly inspection and record keeping requirements as fairly easy to comply with. So hopefully that message conveys to you folks over time, and you find that the permit really has nominal burden on you. I don't think I talk about it, but actually as part of the issuance of the permit, we had to do an economics and benefits analysis, and we determined that this permit will cost vessel operators, on average, it was less than $150 a year per vessel to comply with the permit. So we do believe that there really are, while there may be a long list of these requirements that I talked about, by and large, they're activities that most vessel operators are already doing, or to change will not really incur a significant cost. And so if we can go to the second poll question, kind of gauge what you guys think about the rest of the universe, those that weren't lucky enough to be on the call or on the webinar. Do you believe operators of small vessels are generally aware that the SVGP requirements are set to come into effect December 19th of this year? Yes, the majority of operators are. Probably yes, but outreach is still needed. Probably half and half. The most proactive operators are aware, but most are not, or no, very few operators are aware. And really I'm kind of asking this question to get a sense of how much additional outreach may be necessary over time. And I will remind you that, I think Katie mentioned after the webinar, a survey will pop up, and so if there are specific areas that you'd like additional guidance on, definitely be sure to identify those on the survey, and hopefully we can get the resources to provide that guidance down the road.
All right, so it looks like about half of our audience said that they think the most proactive operators are aware, but most are not. With 30% or 29% saying no, very few operators are aware. 14 said probably half and half. 5 said probably yes, and we had an optimistic 2% that said yes, the majority of operators are aware.
Those are the people from EPA that I think were voting. Yeah, I think what this highlights is that there's definitely still a lot of need for letting folks know that these permit requirements are set to come into effect, provided the moratorium doesn't change and permit requirements take effect in December. So I was guessing that was going to be the case, but I have to admit I think there was even fewer folks, or more folks being unaware than I thought would be. So gives us something to do. So let me just zip through the last few slides, last few sections of the permit, and then we can take some time to answer some more questions. As I mentioned, Part 5 of the permit includes definitions for about 40 terms used in the permit. Listed on this slide are a few of the more important terms, but this is really a reminder that as you go through the permit and you're stumped by requirement or a term, really go to Part 5 and see if that term is further defined, specific for the permit. So when we talk about things like biodegradable or oil or owner or operator, I think that some of those terms may have different meanings or no meaning at all to you, but in the context of the permit, we've really tried to lay out what that means. So Part 5 is the list of definitions. I mentioned the annual noncompliance report. If you have to submit one of those reports, it's to go to a regional office, and Part 6 basically provides the list of regional offices and shows that depending on what state you're in, what region, what EPA region you're located in. So this map kind of shows, which is widely available on our EPA website, but there's a link also on the website or in the permit for the most current contacts in each of our 10 regions and the address to send those reports. So the last section of the permit I want to talk about is Part 7, which includes state and tribe-specific requirements. Almost half of the permit of those 53 pages are these state-specific requirements. And specifically, Section 401 of the Clean Water Act provides the ability for states, territories, and tribes to include additional requirements in EPA permits as they determine appropriate. This part of the permit contains those additional requirements. It doesn't include the fact that the 27 states and the other territories and tribes all determined that the permit as written was adequate for their state. So it's really these 23 states where if you're discharging in these areas, you're going to have to look at Part 7 and see what the other requirements are that apply to you. I'm not going to go through each of the 23 states and tribe requirements, but I took a couple that I'm going to show you just kind of as an example. I will say that there are 23 states, and there, I think, we're like 23 pages of requirements. On average, there's about 1 page per state. Some states have 2 or 3 lines. Some states have 2 or 3 pages of requirements. I kind of picked a couple that were probably on the lesser side for purposes of kind of talking through them. So, for example, Alaska has requirements that include, in addition to sending any non-compliance report to EPA, they require that those reports also be sent to the state. It mentions that if there are any non-compliance events with the state 401 requirements, that they have to take immediate corrective action. With some of these requirements, you'll find might sound very similar to the rest of the permit that applies to everybody. When 401 conditions come in to us from the state, EPA has very little ability to change those requirements, and so we largely leave it up to the state to provide us with the requirements that we put in the permit. And so some of these, there may be some very fine nuances that the state has identified, but often it's like, yeah, we would expect any non-compliance with any part of the permit that the permittee will take appropriate and immediate corrective action. And then the Alaska requirement also says that operators have to be aware of the status of water bodies where they travel. For example, if they're traveling in waters that are impaired for certain pollutants, or if there are additional prohibitions on discharges in those water bodies, the expectation is that the vessel operators will be aware of that and take whatever steps are necessary to ensure that they're not discharging in violation of those requirements. Second example, Michigan. It basically says discharges of black water and gray water to Michigan waters are prohibited. Says that vessel operators are required to notify the state of any discharges causing or contributing to exceedances of water quality standards. And then it says that any discharges causing or contributing to exceedances of water quality standards are prohibited. And that's an example that I didn't talk about, but in Part 4 of our permit, one of the, I believe it's Part 4.11 of the permit actually has a similar prohibition that applies to all discharges, that any discharge cannot cause or contribute to an exceedance of water quality standards. And so those are 2 examples. You'll see in some instances, wow, this really doesn't require us to do much different than what the rest of the permit requires. In other instances, you may find that there are some significant additional requirements. I will say that the requirements, as I mentioned, we really take them from the state, and if you have questions interpreting those 401 provisions in the permit, that we recommend that you direct those questions to the respective state agency. That's kind of a bailout on that part, but it's really we take the requirements as given to us and implement them in the permit. And so that is it. That's the 7 parts of the permit. There were the 2 appendices, the Perry form and the annual noncompliance form. Together is 53 pages, probably about 15 pages of which have really substantive requirements that are going to require you to do something, and then a lot of the rest of the permit, like Section 7, a lot of it won't apply to you, and a lot of the rest of it is kind of boilerplate that kind of establishes legal obligations and liabilities and so forth. I mentioned that we had public notice the draft permit back in 2011. We got 72 sets of public comments on those, and this is just a list of what we changed based on those comments. I will say that in general the comments were fairly minor. I think that's because the permit generally should be fairly easy to comply with, and acknowledging that there are probably some areas more challenging for certain vessels than others, but the comments we received on the proposed permit were fairly straightforward. And so, again, we defined the term technically infeasible, as I mentioned, as it applies to EALs. We added a requirement to remove accumulated bilge water prior to transporting a vessel from one water body to another over land when practicable. We clarified the prohibition against discharging unused live bait from the same water body. Actually, that, yeah. You can only discharge unused live bait to the same water body. We clarified that continuous once-through ambient water used for keeping catch alive during transit is not required to be discharged to shore-based facilities. Clarified in the draft permit, we said periodic visual inspections of the engine and hull, and we clarified that in the final permit to be at least quarterly. We clarified that problems identified during the quarterly inspection are to be corrected as soon as possible. And then we added the inspection waiver for vessels that aren't in the water for that quarter. And that's pretty much the extent of the changes to the SVGP between draft and final, other than trying to clean up the language in places. Oh, and let me go back. If you want to see kind of the full list of what we changed in the Federal Register notice from September 10th, where we announced issuance of the permit, there's a slightly longer list that provides a little more detail on each of those changes that were made. And one last thing, there's something called the Paperwork Reduction Act that requires the federal government to get approval of any information collection activities. These approvals have to be reviewed and reapproved every 3 years. EPA's information collection request for the SVGP was public noticed the same day as the final permit, and it's now open for public comment through November 10th of this year. You can access a copy of our estimate of the information collection from regulations.gov, and there's the docket number, and that docket number actually includes all the documents that were used in preparing the small permit. It includes public comments, response to comments, and the economic and benefits analysis that I mentioned previously. But if you want to comment on the information collection request, that's the document. You can search for what's called the supporting statement and provide any comments by November 10th. And so our estimate for this permit was approximately 1 hour per vessel per year of paperwork needed to comply, with the vast majority of that being for preparation of the PERI form, either at the beginning and then for the quarterly inspections. And I believe with that, we're at the end. I think we have time for questions, and that email address that shows vgp@epa.gov, if we don't get to your question today, you can send them to that. And if they're SVGP related, Kate will send them to V, and if they're VGP related, Kate will answer them. But and I guess just one last thing, there's a link on the bottom of that page to the small vessel general permit website that we maintain through the NPDES program, that really, from that page, you can get to the permit and the fact sheet and any guidance that we prepare, links to any webcast that we may hold in the future, and is really the kind of main page for the small vessel permit. So probably a good one to bookmark if you're covered by the permit. So I think with that, Kate will ask a few questions that we got.
Well, great. Thanks, Jack. So there were several questions that came in related to additional clarification on Blackwater and sewage. So I thought I'd go ahead and try and answer that one first. There was some confusion about whether or not Blackwater or sewage would require an additional permit or an additional NPDES permit. The short answer to that is no. The SVGP does not practically change any of the existing sewage requirements that already apply to these vessels. The reason we draw the distinction about vessel sewage not being an authorized discharge under this permit is because it's actually covered under a different section of the Clean Water Act and is not part of our 402 or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program. It's specifically covered under a different program. So us telling you that it's not authorized under this permit does not practically change any existing requirements that you may have related to sewage, and does not mean that you need to obtain additional permit coverage for that sewage discharge. So it's just simply that it's not, because of the way that our program is set up, it's not an authorized discharge under our program, and the existing requirements sort of are what they are for your vessels, and the SVGP does not change those. Where we do come in with a requirement is for gray water. And that again is an authorized discharge, and as Jack went through, it does have requirements associated with gray water discharges. Black water is not covered or regulated under this permit. So with that, how about another question about scope? So one person asked, is it correct that the rule applies only inside 3 nautical miles and does not apply in the U.S. EEZ between 3 and 200 nautical miles?
Yes, that is correct. I think in the part 1.3, 1.2 of the permit, it identifies the waters covered by the permit, and it clarifies that the permit is applicable out to the 3-mile territorial sea limit. I think there's kind of a long history with why it's 3. I think a lot of other programs have used a 12-mile boundary, but for vessel discharges, it continues to be 3.
Okay. Another question we got from a few people, we'll go ahead and answer whether or not this presentation will be posted on the website or whether the slides and audio will be made available after the presentation. The answer to both of those questions is yes, they will be. We will post the link to this archived webinar on our website. In addition, you'll also be emailed a link at the end of the presentation that gives you a link back to the archived presentation and audio. So those will both be made available to you after the presentation. Another question. Is there any kind of formal documentation necessary to state that vessels excluded from the SVGP, that a determination was made that a vessel is excluded from the SVGP? Do they need to actually submit anything formally to us?
No, there's nothing that needs to be submitted. And in fact, there's nothing that needs to be, that's required to be documented on your part. I will just suggest that in any decision you make, it's always very useful to document your rationale for how you arrived at that conclusion, and to keep that information with you should you be questioned by anybody, that you will have a your reasoned interpretation of your decision at that time, but that doesn't have to be submitted.
Another question, how long after December 19th, 2014 will vessel owners have to obtain permit coverage before they are non-compliant? So the requirement to obtain permit coverage will be effective on the 19th. So since you do not have to submit an NOI, you actually, by filling out the PARI form, will be covered automatically, and you're required to have obtained coverage or to fill out that form on December 19th if you are operating in U.S. waters at the time. So in other words, if you coverage needs to be obtained via filling out and signing the PARI form when you are operating in U.S. waters after that December 19th date.
So sign the PARI on or before December 19th to receive coverage under the permit.
issued for each subject vessel or to cover a fleet of vessels?
I mean, the way general permits work is it is only one permit. So we issued a single small vessel general permit that then applies to a host of vessels. And so each vessel has to comply with that permit. And so if you're filling out a PERI form, each vessel will have to have their own PERI form. If they have to submit an annual noncompliance report, each vessel will have to submit if they have non-compliance. So it really, there is only one permit, but each vessel kind of gets treated separately under that permit.
Okay. Another question related to ballast water. Are there technology requirements for ballast water or simply best management practices under the small vessel general permit?
There are simply best management practices under the small vessel general permit for ballast water.
And those requirements are in
Part 2.9.
Another question, we received a couple like this asking whether or not a vessel less than 26 feet are exempt from the SVGP.
Not necessarily. I think the example used 26 feet, but it could be any size boat if it's non-recreational, non-military, less than 79 feet.
Would be SVGP.
Would be SVGP.
Okay. So in terms of the PARI form or the annual noncompliance form, who is authorized to sign or certify those documents?
The way the permit is written, it has to be an authorized official of the company or their duly authorized representative. And basically the permit talks about who an authorized official is, and it's I don't have the language in front of me, but it's a partner or proprietor or a official of an agency or a senior officer of a company, or their duly authorized representative. And the way duly authorized representative is written is that one of those authorizing officials can basically sign their responsibility to somebody, and that just would require them to, in writing, document that they've given their responsibility over to either a specific person or to a specific title of a position that is going to be responsible for conducting that activity. And so then the expectation is that you'll retain that authorization note in the file, and then that authorized representative can then fill out the PERI, can do the inspections. It's unlike, if you're familiar with the vessel general permit, for submitting the notice of intent, we hold the submitter of the NOIs to the higher standard of not allowing the authorizing official to designate somebody to sign the form. It has to be one of those actual officials. For the SVGP, we've given them the ability to authorize someone else.
So once EPA receives a non-compliance form, one person asked, will the public have access to that report? Will the non-compliance report be publicly available?
We don't have a system set up to make it readily available. I can't say what our Freedom of Information Act laws may provide for. My sense is that, yes, it actually probably would be available if somebody asked for it, but you know, again, if you're familiar with the VGP, we've set up a system where all the reports that get submitted are immediately publicly available for folks, for the public to view. We don't have and don't plan to have a system for the small vessel permit like that. That's kind of a half answer.
All right, let's switch topics. We got a question about vessel length. And are we using the Coast Guard registered length listed in their documents, or length overall, or some other measurement of length?
The beauty of the, I was going to say the beauty is that I was going to say we had a definition.
I believe we use the Coast Guard registered length. I know the VGP has a definition of length associated with it, so it would be the same definition that's used for the VGP.
Yeah. We just neglected to include it in the SVGP.
Okay, let's see what else we have. So what is the best way for a vessel operator to get more clarity from EPA regarding whether their specific vessel meets the definition of a recreational vessel? They have questions. Who should they contact, and how should they proceed?
And I would suggest sending those to the VGP at EPA.gov mailbox, and if it's a relatively straightforward question, we can get back to you, and if it's more complicated, then you can call. We'll let you know who to call, and we can talk through it. That is one of the areas that we're working on, putting together some FAQs to provide some additional insight into the types of vessels required and not required to get permit coverage.
There were a couple of questions, too, about the PARI form reflected on our website, and just wanted to make a clarifying point. Because we have a separate link to the PARI form for the vessel general permit on our website, I think that may be causing some confusion. The PARI form that's actually included in the SVGP would be the one that applies in this case. The PARI form for the vessel general permit is a separate document and applies to certain vessels covered under the VGP, not the SVGP. So I think there were a couple of questions about it looking different than what we included in the presentation. The version that was included or referenced in the presentation is the correct form and is included as part of the permit. And we'll likely break it out as a separate PDF and include it on the SVGP website at a later date. But
yeah, we kind of, I resisted making it a separate file from the standpoint that it's something that you have to fill out initially and then sign every quarter over the course of 5 years. And so it's something that, you know, ideally you would think it'd be something, oh yeah, every quarter I can do it electronically, but fact is, other than the very first time, after that you're going to be, you know, signing and dating it by hand. But I think it sounds as though it would be beneficial to make that form available kind of as a standalone PDF file. So we'll do that and make it clear that there's a difference between the VGP and SVGP forms.
Okay. So speaking of quarterly inspections, one person asked who is responsible for the quarterly inspections. Is it the respective boat captain, and who conducts the follow-up inspections? Covered this a little bit, maybe and clarify it again, of who's actually in charge of doing the inspections.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned that it's the authorized official or their duly authorized representative of the vessel, and there's kind of the owner-operator question, and we provide flexibility as to whether the owner or the operator, if it's different than the owner, conducts those inspections. There is the ability for either one of those, as long as it's an authorized official of the owner or the operator, or again the duly authorized representative of either of those, can perform those inspections, can retain those inspection results on the vessel. In certain instances, it just makes a lot more sense for an operator who's not an owner to actually conduct the inspections, since they're the ones that are going to be on the vessel in many instances. But you do have flexibility.
I think we have time for just a few more questions. So one person wrote in and asked, what do we mean by when we say you're not in the water for that quarter? Does it mean you physically are removed from the water or in dry dock, or are you tied up and non-operational?
It means you're physically not in the water for that quarter.
You're removed and
Removed from the water completely for the entire quarter. Then you're exempt from the inspection requirements.
And another person asked, does the hull of the vessel have to be inspected internally and externally quarterly?
To the extent that those parts of the hull have potential to affect the discharges, then yes. To the extent they don't, then no. I think the requirement kind of talks about above line water hull inspections need to be done quarterly, and then when the vessel is removed from the water at any point, that you have to inspect the rest of the vessel hull at that point.
Okay, so I think we'll have time for one last question. Several people asked will operators be subject to penalties for noncompliance, or other questions related to how enforcement might look like, what enforcement may look like for this permit, how many violations will result in the fine, and things like that. So some general questions about enforcement and what enforcement would look like for the SVGP.
Yeah, well, like all the NPDES permits, and in fact all the EPA regulations, requirements, we have an Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance that oversees the enforcement program, and it's really an enforcement discretion for each and every violation, and whether there's any action taken in response to a violation. You could probably, we have a system called ECHO that actually online on EPA's website that provides information on dischargers and their reporting information and whether they've had violations and so forth, and I believe it also shows any penalties that have been taken, and there you probably can see that there are a number of violations for which there was no enforcement action taken, or it might be a notice of violation or something. So it really comes down to the discretion of our enforcement office as to what actions, or if they will take any actions. Again, the Clean Water Act establishes kind of the maximum authority we have under law, but my sense is that it's rare that when there are enforcement actions that we're assessing the fully allowable penalties for those actions.
Well, I think that is all the time we have today. I just wanted to reiterate, there are a couple people asked again for contact information. If you have questions about either the vessel general permit or the small vessel general permit, you can send them to bgp@epa.gov, and we will do our best to respond as quickly as possible to those questions.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Jack. And everyone else on the phone, thank you for your participation. As a reminder, you will see a brief survey pop up on your screen once the webinar ends. So your feedback is very important to us. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we would appreciate it. Thank you. That concludes this webinar.